A homeless veteran gets the death penalty, and the whole town turns its back on him. But just hours before his execution, his little daughter, only 8 years old, does the unthinkable. She doesn't speak a word, but what she reveals shakes the justice system to its core, because her silent drawings hold the key to a truth no one dared to see. What did she uncover? And how far will she go to save the only family she has left? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Through sheets of rain, the neon sign of Al's Pawn and Loan buzzed and flickered, casting sickly yellow light onto the wet sidewalk. Eli Ramirez stumbled forward, his worn military coat heavy with rainwater. The coat had seen better days, just like its owner. Patches were coming loose at the shoulders, and the fabric was frayed at the edges, telling the story of years of neglect. Inside his head, the world spun in confused circles. Fragments of memories, explosions, screaming, radio static, crashed against each other like waves in a storm. Eli's hands trembled as he pushed open the shop's door, triggering a small bell that seemed to ring too loudly in the quiet space. The interior was a maze of mismatched treasures and forgotten possessions. Glass display cases housed tarnished jewelry and old watches. Guitars hung on the walls like sleeping bats. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating odd shadows in the corners of the cramped space. Behind the counter, Al Martinez's eyes widened with recognition. The color drained from his round face as he took a small step backward, his hand disappearing beneath the counter. "Mr. Ramirez," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We're about to close up." Eli's eyes darted around the shop, not really seeing. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. His breathing came in short, sharp bursts. "Jenkins," he muttered. "Got to find Jenkins." "Sir?" Al's voice shook slightly. "There's no Jenkins here." But Eli wasn't in the pawn shop anymore, not in his mind. The displays of old electronics transformed into burned-out vehicles. The glass cases became concrete barriers. The rain beating against the windows sounded exactly like distant gunfire, and that's what his mind decided it was. "Taking fire." Eli's voice was hoarse, desperate. "Jenkins, report position." Al's hand trembled as he pressed the silent alarm button under the counter. "Mr. Ramirez, please. You need to leave." The fluorescent light flickered and something in Eli's mind snapped. His hand went to his waistband, and Al ducked behind the counter with a yelp. The world dissolved into chaos. Glass shattered as display cases exploded. Gunshots rang out, deafening in the confined space. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. Officer Daniel Keene was first on scene, his patrol car's tires splashing through puddles as he pulled up outside. The backup units were still 2 minutes out, but the dispatcher had reported shots fired. Time was critical. "I'm going in," he radioed, checking his weapon. "Suspect is possibly armed and unstable." The bell chimed again as Keene entered, his boots crunching on broken glass. "Police, drop your weapon." More crashing sounds came from the back of the store. Keene moved forward carefully, using the shelving units as cover. The air smelled of gunpowder and rain. "Jenkins," Eli's voice echoed from somewhere in the darkness. "Enemies got us surrounded." "Sir, this is Officer Keene. Put down your weapon. We can talk about this." A struggle erupted in the shadows. There was the sound of bodies colliding, of desperate breathing, of a gun clattering across the floor. Then silence fell like a heavy curtain. When backup arrived moments later, they found a scene frozen in tragedy. Eli lay unconscious on the floor, his hands sticky with blood that wasn't his own. The gun had skidded under a nearby shelf. And Officer Keene, young dedicated Officer Keene, lay motionless beside him, his eyes staring at nothing. The rain continued its relentless drumming as officers dragged Eli's limp form out into the night. Red and blue lights painted the wet streets in alternating colors, reflecting off windows and puddles like a carnival gone wrong. "Morgan," Eli mumbled as they pulled him toward the waiting patrol car. "Jenkins, don't leave them behind." Across the street, in a parked car with foggy windows, 8-year-old Aria sat perfectly still. Her small hands clutched a sketch pad so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't make a sound, hadn't made a sound in months, but her eyes, wide and knowing, took in everything. The rain peppered the windshield like bullets, each drop an echo of the chaos she'd just witnessed. Her father's confused face, illuminated by the strobing lights, burned itself into her memory. Without looking down, her fingers began moving across the paper, the pencil scratching out shapes in the darkness. The scene before her transformed through her young hands. The police cars became dark, angular monsters with glowing eyes. The rain turned to tears falling from a sky full of grief. And in the center of it all, her father, lost in a battle that only he could see, fighting enemies that existed only in his damaged mind. More patrol cars arrived, their sirens cutting through the night like wailing ghosts. Officers shouted orders. Radios crackled with codes and confirmations. But Arya remained silent, her pencil never stopping, capturing the moment her world changed forever in stark lines and shadowy shapes. The rain drummed harder, drowning out the sound of car doors slamming, of her father being read his rights, of the growing crowd of onlookers who gathered at the edges of the police tape like moths drawn to the flashing lights. Each drop hit the windshield with the sharp report of a gunshot, but Arya didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that sometimes the loudest battles were the ones fought in silence. Her father disappeared into the back of a patrol car, his vacant eyes staring through the rain-streaked window, but seeing something far away, something only he could see. The car pulled away from the curb, carrying him into a future that would change both their lives forever. Arya's pencil finally stilled. On the page before her, in the harsh alternating glare of red and blue, lay the truth as only she could tell it. Not in words, words had failed her long ago, but in images that spoke of confusion, of fear, of a man lost in the shadows of his own mind. And somewhere in those careful lines, in those precise shadows, lay the beginning of a story that would take years to fully tell. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations and shuffling papers. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. 3 months had passed since that rainy night, but the weight of it still hung heavy in the air. The prosecutor, Sarah Matthews, stood before the jury with perfect posture and unwavering confidence. Her navy suit was crisp, her voice clear and measured as she addressed the 12 people who held Eli Ramirez's fate in their hands. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Matthews began, her heels clicking against the floor as she paced. "What we have here is tragic but simple. A decorated veteran, yes, but one whose PTSD made him dangerous. On the night of March 15th, Eli Ramirez entered Al's pawn shop with a loaded weapon. When Officer Daniel Keene responded to the silent alarm, Mr. Ramirez shot him in cold blood." In the gallery, Arya sat alone on a hard wooden bench, her small frame almost swallowed by the empty space around her. Her social worker, Mrs. Chen, had stepped out to take a phone call. Arya's dark eyes remained fixed on her sketch pad, her pencil moving in swift, sure strokes across the paper. "The evidence is clear," Matthews continued. "Mr. Ramirez's fingerprints were on the weapon. Gunshot residue was found on his hands. He was caught at the scene, covered in Officer Keene's blood." Eli sat at the defense table, his orange jumpsuit bright against the dark wood. His eyes were distant, unfocused, as if watching a different scene play out before him. His court-appointed lawyer, Mark Davidson, a young man with an ill-fitting suit and nervous hands, shuffled through his papers without really seeing them. "Furthermore," Matthews gestured to a stack of medical records, "Mr. Ramirez has a documented history of violent episodes related to his PTSD. He was a ticking time bomb, and Officer Keene paid the ultimate price." Arya's pencil paused. She looked up at her father, studying the hollow of his cheeks, the dark circles under his eyes. Her drawing showed him differently, not as the broken man in orange, but as the father who used to teach her secret codes through pictures, who helped her speak through art when words failed. Dr. Patricia Wells, the prosecution's expert witness, took the stand next. Her credentials were impressive, her manner professional as she detailed Eli's mental state. "Based on my evaluation," Dr. Wells testified, Mr. Ramirez exhibits severe PTSD symptoms, including flashbacks, dissociative episodes, and periods of extreme agitation. During these episodes, he often cannot distinguish reality from his combat memories. Davidson stood for cross-examination, his tie slightly askew. But doesn't that suggest my client wasn't in control of his actions that night? Objection leading, Matthews called out. Sustained, Judge Harrison responded, his voice tired. Davidson fumbled with his notes. Let me rephrase. Dr. Wells, in your professional opinion, what is Mr. Ramirez's ability to form intent during these episodes? While his judgment is certainly impaired, Dr. Wells answered, PTSD doesn't automatically negate criminal responsibility. The defense's case continued to unravel. When Davidson questioned the missing surveillance footage, the tech expert dismissed it as routine corruption of old equipment. When he tried to establish Eli's stellar military record, Matthews countered with incident reports from his VA therapy sessions. Through it all, Aria drew. Her pictures told a different story, shadows that didn't match the official narrative, angles that suggested another presence in the shop that night. But no one looked at her drawings. No one asked why she stayed silent. Eli barely seemed to register the proceedings. Sometimes he muttered names, Jenkins, Morgan, Thompson, soldiers who hadn't made it home. Other times, he stared at his hands as if still seeing blood there. The jury took only 4 hours to deliberate. When they filed back in, the tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut. Aria's pencil moved faster, more urgently across her paper. The forewoman stood, her hand trembling slightly as she held the verdict form. In the matter of the state versus Eli Ramirez, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The word fell like a stone in still water. Ripples of reaction moved through the courtroom. Sighs, whispers, the scratch of reporters' pens. Eli showed no reaction, as if the word meant nothing to him. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, his face grave. Mr. Ramirez, please rise for sentencing. Eli stood mechanically, his chains rattling. Davidson placed a steadying hand on his arm. Eli Ramirez, your actions took the life of a dedicated public servant. Officer Keene left behind a wife, 2 children, and a community that trusted him to protect them. Given the severity of this crime and your apparent lack of remorse, I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Mrs. Chen, who had returned to sit behind Aria, gasped softly, but Aria's pencil never stopped moving. As guards moved to lead him away, Eli's eyes finally focused. They found Aria across the courtroom, and for a moment, father and daughter connected. Recognition flickered across his face, not just of her, but of something more. Don't let them, he began, struggling against the guard's grip, but they pulled him toward the door before he could finish. Aria's pencil made one final, decisive stroke. On her paper, a dark figure reached out with a bleeding hand, its shadow stretching across the page like a secret waiting to be told. The courtroom began to empty. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. The prosecutor packed her briefcase. Davidson stood alone at the defense table, looking lost. But Aria remained seated, her eyes on her drawing, her silence holding all the words she couldn't say. The morning after the sentencing, gray light filtered through dusty windows at the Meadowbrook foster home. The Victorian-style house might have once been grand, but now its paint peeled and its floorboards creaked under the weight of too many footsteps. Inside, 12 children shared 4 bedrooms, their voices echoing through narrow hallways. Aria sat cross-legged on the floor of her new room, which she shared with 2 other girls. Her small suitcase remained unpacked in the corner, but her sketchpad and pencils were already spread out before her. The bed assigned to her stood untouched, its flowered comforter still perfectly smooth. Mrs. Chen, her social worker, perched on the edge of that bed, her kind face creased with worry. She held out a sandwich on a paper plate, peanut butter and jelly, cut diagonally the way most kids liked it. Aria, sweetheart, you need to eat something, Mrs. Chen said softly. You haven't had anything since yesterday morning. Aria's pencil moved steadily across the paper. her dark eyes focused entirely on her work. The scratch of graphite against paper was her only response. Mrs. Chen leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the drawing. "What are you working on? Would you like to show me?" On the page, a serene landscape took shape. Rolling hills, peaceful clouds, a small house with smoke curling from its chimney. But in the shadows of the trees, barely visible unless you knew where to look, Arya had hidden other images. A knife with a jagged edge, an alleyway that seemed to lead nowhere, a police badge partially obscured by darkness. "Dr. Martinez is coming by later," Mrs. Chen continued, setting the sandwich down beside Arya. "She's a very nice lady who helps children talk about their feelings. Would you like that?" Arya started a new drawing, her strokes becoming sharper, more urgent. The peaceful scene disappeared, replaced by harsh lines and deep shadows. Mrs. Chen sighed, checking her watch. "I'll come back this afternoon to check on you. Please try to eat something, okay?" The door clicked shut behind her. Down the hall, children's voices rose and fell, arguing over toys, calling for the house mother's attention, living their lives as if the world hadn't just shattered into pieces. Arya's stomach growled, but she ignored it. Food tasted like nothing now anyway. Instead, she reached for a fresh sheet of paper, her mind drifting back to a different time, a different room, where the air smelled of coffee and charcoal dust. The memory rose clear and sharp. Sunday morning in their small apartment, sunlight streaming through open windows. Eli sat cross-legged on the floor beside her, just as she sat now, but his face was different then. Relaxed, present, his eyes clear and focused on their shared project. "See how the charcoal moves?" he demonstrated, his strong hands gentle as they guided the stick across rough paper. "You can make soft shadows or dark lines depending on how you hold it." 6-year-old Arya watched, fascinated, as landscapes emerged from nothing but black dust and white space. Her father's fingers were stained dark, and a smudge of charcoal marked his cheek where he'd absently touched it. "Now watch this," Eli said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Remember how I told you about sending secret messages during the war?" Arya nodded eagerly. This was her favorite part of their Sunday drawing lessons. "Well, artists can hide messages too." He showed her how to work symbols into the natural lines of a drawing, a series of dots that looked like stones but spelled out words in Morse code, patterns in tree branches that contained hidden numbers. "Sometimes," he explained, "the truth is too big for words. Sometimes you have to hide it in plain sight, let people discover it slowly." His eyes grew distant for a moment, but he shook it off quickly. "Want to try?" Arya grabbed a piece of charcoal, her small face scrunched in concentration. Under her father's guidance, she learned to weave meaning into shadows, to make every line count twice. "That's my girl," Eli beamed as she successfully hid her first message, her name, in a drawing of their apartment building. "You're a natural code maker." Arya's face had lit up with pride, a rare, brilliant smile breaking through her usual reserve. In that moment, she wasn't the quiet girl who rarely spoke at school, who preferred pictures to words. She was her father's daughter, keeper of secrets, artist of hidden truths. The memory faded, leaving Arya back in her foster home room. Outside, other children ran past her door, their footsteps thundering on old wood. Someone was crying in another room. A television blared downstairs, but Arya remained still, her pencil moving with new purpose. The lessons from those Sunday mornings had stayed with her, becoming more vital now than ever before. Each stroke was deliberate, each shadow carefully placed. The pawnshop took shape on her paper, not as the police photos had shown it, not as the newspapers had printed it, but as she remembered seeing it that rainy night. The front window with its neon sign, the cluttered display of old guitars and jewelry. But there was something else, something that hadn't been mentioned in the trial. In the corner of her drawing, partially hidden behind a tall shelf, stairs led down to a basement level. They weren't obvious. You had to know how to look, how to read the shadows. But they were there, clear as day to anyone who understood her father's lessons about hidden truths. Arya pinned the finished drawing to her wall, right beside her bed where she could see it clearly. She sat back on her heels, staring at it with unwavering focus. The stairs seemed to grow darker the longer she looked, as if they led somewhere important, somewhere necessary. Beyond her window, storm clouds began to gather, turning the morning gray to afternoon black. They rolled in from the west, heavy with rain and electricity. Just like the night everything changed. A distant rumble of thunder made the other children in the house squeal and run for cover, but Arya didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the drawing, on the stairs that nobody had mentioned, on the truth hidden in plain sight. Outside, the storm drew closer, but inside, in the quiet of her mind, pieces were finally starting to come together. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the dusty windows of Grace Halpern's downtown office. Case files formed precarious towers on her desk, each one representing another person's desperate bid for freedom. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as she dove into her newest assignment. Grace pushed her reading glasses up her nose, squinting at the manila folder labeled Ramirez Eli. Her fingers, stained with highlighter ink, traced down the pages of court transcripts. Everything looked depressingly routine. Another violent crime, another quick conviction, another life thrown away. Perfect, she muttered, tossing her pen onto the cluttered desk. Just perfect. The case had landed on her desk that morning, dumped there by her supervisor who knew she couldn't refuse. Public defenders were overwhelmed, and appellate lawyers like Grace picked up the pieces. 20 years of practicing law had taught her that most appeals were exercises in futility. But something about this file nagged at her. The trial transcript was too clean, too neat. The defense attorney had barely cross-examined witnesses, no attempt to suppress evidence, no expert testimonies beyond a cursory psychological evaluation. It was as if everyone had simply gone through the motions. Grace pulled out her legal pad, making quick notes. Defendant, Eli Ramirez, former military, decorated service record. Charge, first-degree murder of Officer Daniel Keene. Scene, local pawn shop, late night. Evidence, blood on hands, gun nearby, witness testimony from shop clerk. Way too clean, she mumbled, reaching for her cold coffee anyway. Cases this straightforward usually had complications buried underneath. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. Her eyes fell on a sticky note attached to the file. Client visit required within 48 hours. Grace groaned, checking her watch. The prison was an hour's drive, and visiting hours would end soon. Might as well get it over with, she sighed, gathering her things. She'd seen too many cases like this one, defendants claiming innocence despite overwhelming evidence. They all started to sound the same after a while. The drive to the state prison was familiar, every pothole and turn memorized from countless visits. Grace had stopped noticing the razor wire years ago, barely registered the clang of heavy doors or the hollow echo of her heels on concrete floors. The meeting room was small and stark, painted institutional beige. Grace arranged her papers on the metal table, preparing for another frustrating conversation with another desperate client. When the guards brought Eli in, she almost missed him. He moved quietly, despite his chains, his presence somehow less substantial than his physical size would suggest. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss. "Mr. Ramirez," Grace began, her tone professional but distant. "I'm Grace Halpern, your appellate attorney." Eli sat without speaking, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes. "I've reviewed your case file," she continued, shuffling papers. "I need to understand your version of events." "They wanted someone to blame," Eli said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "Someone who already looked guilty." Grace had heard variations of this before. She clicked her pen, prepared to take perfunctory notes. "Can you walk me through what happened that night?" "Parts are missing." Eli's hands twitched slightly. "I remember the rain, the shop. There was a door, chained shut, someone watching." He paused, forehead creasing. Then nothing until the cuffs went on. Grace fought the urge to roll her eyes, memory gaps conveniently covering the crucial moments, classic signs of either guilt or psychosis. Neither helped their case. Mr. Ramirez, I need something concrete to work with. The evidence against you is substantial. I didn't kill that cop. His voice remained steady, but his eyes finally met hers. They were clear, focused. I wouldn't. Not with Aria waiting in the car. Grace consulted her notes. Your daughter? The one who witnessed your arrest? Something flickered across Eli's face. Pain, fear. She couldn't quite read it. Please, he said, leaning forward slightly. Check on her. The foster system. It's not good for her. She doesn't talk much, but her drawings. Mr. Ramirez, I'm your appellate attorney, not a social worker. Just see her, please. For the first time, real emotion cracked through his composed exterior. She sees things others miss. Grace gathered her papers, already mentally composing her initial appeal brief. Another dead-end case. Another waste of time. But something in Eli's last plea stuck with her, an echo of genuine concern that felt different from the usual manipulations she encountered. The foster home was a Victorian-era building that had seen better days. Paint peeled from the trim, and the front steps sagged slightly. Grace checked the address again, wondering if this visit was worth her billable hours. Mrs. Chen, the social worker, led her upstairs. Aria hasn't spoken since the arrest, she explained. We're trying to get her into therapy, but... She gestured helplessly at the closed door ahead of them. The room was small, shared by 3 girls according to the name tags on the beds. Aria sat alone by the window, a sketch pad balanced on her knees. She didn't look up when they entered. Aria? Mrs. Chen said softly. This is Ms. Halpern. She's helping your father. Grace stood awkwardly, unused to dealing with children. Hello, Aria. Your father asked me to check on you. No response. The pencil moved steadily across the paper, creating lines and shadows Grace couldn't quite make out from where she stood. Well, Grace sighed after a moment of uncomfortable silence. I should get going. She turned toward the door, already thinking about the mountain of paperwork waiting at her office. A small sound made her pause. The rustle of paper, followed by light footsteps. Aria stood beside her, face tilted up, dark eyes intense and knowing. Without a word, she held out a folded piece of paper. Grace took it automatically, watching as the child returned to her spot by the window. Curious despite herself, Grace unfolded the drawing. The pawn shop emerged in perfect detail. Every brick, every crack in the sidewalk rendered with surprising skill. But there, in the corner, something caught her eye. Hidden in the shadows of the shop's interior, a green-lit exit sign glowed beneath street level, and across the bottom, in careful block letters, 3 words that made Grace's professional skepticism waver. He's still there. Grace's heels clicked against the empty hallway floor as she made her way back to her office. The building was quiet at this hour, most of the other lawyers and staff long gone. Only the occasional hum of the janitor's vacuum cleaner broke the silence. She flipped on her desk lamp, casting a warm glow across the cramped space. Law books lined the walls, and case files were stacked in precarious towers on every surface. But her eyes went straight to Aria's drawing, still folded in her hand. With careful movements, she pulled out a corkboard from behind her filing cabinet and cleared a space on her wall. The drawing felt delicate as she pinned it up, like something that might dissolve if handled too roughly. Grace stepped back, crossing her arms as she studied the image. The pawn shop emerged from the paper in stark detail, every brick precisely placed, each window frame exactly measured. The shadows fell at accurate angles, creating depth that seemed impossible for an 8-year-old to capture. This isn't right, she muttered, leaning closer. The basement layout caught her attention. Clean lines showed hallways, storage spaces, and what appeared to be precise measurements in the margins. The detail work was beyond what any child should be capable of, even one as obviously talented as Aria. Grace pulled out her phone, Googling architectural drawings. The style matched, the cross-sections, the perspective, the notation system. This wasn't just a child's sketch. This was something else entirely. Her computer hummed to life as she logged into the city's building permit database. 20 years of legal work had given her access to various municipal systems, though she rarely needed them for appellate cases. Her fingers flew across the keyboard searching for the pawnshop's address. The original building permits appeared on her screen, yellowed with age, even in digital form. Grace's eyes narrowed as she studied them. According to the official plans, the structure was simple: a single-story commercial space with standard foundation. No basement level, no underground storage. She printed both the permits and a clean copy of Aria's drawing, laying them side by side on her desk. The official blueprints showed solid ground beneath the shop floor, but when she overlaid Aria's drawing, a significant discrepancy emerged. Where there should have been earth and foundation, the child had drawn a hollow space, rooms and corridors that officially didn't exist. Grace grabbed a red marker circling the access point Aria had indicated. It sat behind the main counter, a simple trapdoor that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The green exit sign she'd drawn above it seemed almost like an afterthought, but Grace had learned that details in Aria's drawings were never accidental. She sat back in her chair, mind racing. If there really was an unauthorized basement level, it wouldn't appear in any official records. The perfect place to hide something, or someone. The night passed in a blur of research and coffee. By morning, Grace had a decision to make. She could file the standard appeals paperwork, going through proper channels that would likely lead nowhere. Or she could follow the lead of an 8-year-old's drawing. Dawn was breaking as Grace pulled up to the pawn shop. Yellow police tape still crossed the entrance, though it had been torn in places by wind and weather. Plywood covered the windows, and a condemned notice was stapled to the door. Grace parked around the corner out of sight from the main street. She'd dressed down in jeans and a dark jacket, her usual court attire abandoned for something more suitable for breaking and entering. The irony of an officer of the court committing a crime wasn't lost on her. The side window was partially boarded, leaving a gap just wide enough to squeeze through if she was careful. Grace tested the edge of the plywood, finding it loose enough to pull back slightly. With a grunt of effort and a silent prayer that no early morning traffic would pass by, she hoisted herself through the opening. She landed in a cloud of dust, coughing quietly as particles swirled in the dim light filtering through cracks in the boards. The shop looked frozen in time, stuck in the moment just after the shooting. Display cases were shattered, their contents long since collected as evidence. Papers and broken merchandise littered the floor, undisturbed except for a layer of gray dust. Grace pulled out a small flashlight, sweeping its beam across the space. Everything matched Aria's drawing perfectly. The layout of the shelves, the position of the counter, even the pattern of the cracked linoleum floor. She moved carefully, avoiding the areas she remembered from crime scene photos. Behind the counter, glass crunched under her feet. This was where Officer Keene had fallen, where Eli had been found unconscious. Grace pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on the floor beneath her feet. According to Aria's drawing, the access point should be there. A square outline in the floor nearly invisible under years of dirt and grime. Grace knelt down, brushing away dust with her sleeve. Her fingers found the edge of a handle, recessed into the floor. She lifted her flashlight, heart pounding as the beam caught something overhead. A sign hung at an angle, its green paint faded and cracked. Though the bulb was broken, the letters were clear. Exit. Exactly as Aria had drawn it. Grace stared at the trapdoor, her legal training warring with instinct. This was the moment to call the police, to do things properly through official channels. But something told her that evidence had a way of disappearing in this case. If she left now, this door might vanish as completely as the surveillance footage had. The handle was cool under her fingers as she gripped it, preparing to pull. Above her, the broken exit sign cast its shadow across the floor, marking a path into darkness that no official blueprint had ever recorded. The trapdoor groaned as Grace worked her fingers under the edge, decades of dirt and grime making it stick. She had to throw her weight against it twice before it finally gave way with a rusty screech that echoed through the empty shop. Stale air wafted up from the darkness below, carrying the musty scent of long-abandoned spaces. Grace's flashlight beam revealed a set of wooden stairs descending into blackness. The steps were worn smooth in the middle, evidence of frequent use despite the building's official records showing no basement level. Dust motes danced in the light like falling ash, disturbed for the first time in years. Her heart pounded as she stood at the top of the stairs. The rational part of her mind, the part that had argued countless appeals and knew the importance of proper procedure, screamed at her to back away and call the police. But something about Aria's drawing, with its precise measurements and hidden details, compelled her forward. Grace pulled out her phone and activated its flashlight for additional illumination. The wooden steps creaked ominously under her weight as she began her descent. The air grew colder with each step, and a clammy dampness clung to her skin. The beam of her flashlight caught cobwebs in the corners, and the walls were rough concrete, unmarked by any attempt at finishing. At the bottom, Grace swept her light across what appeared to be a storage area. Old furniture and boxes were scattered about, covered in sheets that had long since gathered dust. The space stretched further back than she would have expected, disappearing into shadows beyond her light's reach. She moved carefully through the clutter, noting how some items seemed deliberately arranged while others were clearly tossed aside haphazardly. A path had been worn through the debris, leading toward the back of the basement. Grace followed it, her footsteps echoing despite her attempts to move quietly. Behind a hanging sheet of yellowed plastic, something caught her eye. The beam of her flashlight revealed a section of wall that looked different from the rest. Newer concrete with slight variations in color and texture. Grace ran her fingers along the edge, feeling a slight draft. A false wall. The surface was thin, more like paneling than actual concrete. Grace found a loose edge and pulled, the material giving way with surprising ease. Behind it, a hidden room opened up, and her breath caught in her throat. The space was small but meticulously organized. Glass display cases lined one wall, each containing carefully labeled items. Watches, rings, earrings, personal effects of all kinds. Each item had a small tag with a date and what appeared to be a case number. But it was the opposite wall that made Grace's blood run cold. A large pegboard covered the entire surface, yellowed newspaper clippings pinned in neat rows. The articles featured photos and stories about law enforcement officers and military personnel. Some headlines announced deaths, others celebrated acquittals and cleared names. Red string connected certain articles to others, creating a web of relationships that made sense only to its creator. Grace's hands shook as she examined the display. Every article had one thing in common, a single name that appeared again and again: Randall Briggs, forensic analyst. His name was quoted in testimonies, cited in evidence reports, listed as an expert witness. Below the pegboard sat a row of drawers, each labeled with the same careful precision as the display cases. Grace pulled one open, her heart nearly stopping at what she found inside. A police badge lay on black velvet, its surface dark with dried blood. The label read simply, "Keen Complete." The implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was a trophy collection. Each item represented a case, a victim, a life altered or ended, and all of them connected back to one man, Randall Briggs, the forensic analyst whose testimony had helped convict Eli. Grace's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, forcing herself to document everything. She took photo after photo, the pegboard, the display cases, the labeled drawers. Each click of her camera felt too loud in the oppressive silence of the basement. The evidence was overwhelming. Briggs hadn't just testified in these cases. He had orchestrated them. The shrine was proof of a methodical mind that took pride in its work, carefully cataloging each successful manipulation of the justice system. As she photographed the last drawer, a sound from above made her freeze. The distinct creak of the shop's front door opening carried down the stairs, followed by the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the floor above. Grace quickly shut off both lights, plunging herself into total darkness. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure it would give away her position. The footsteps continued, moving with purpose across the shop floor. Someone who knew exactly where they were going. Grace pressed herself against the wooden base of the counter, her heart thundering so loudly she feared it would give her away. The floorboards above the basement creaked as footsteps approached, slow and methodical. She had barely made it up from the basement and behind the counter when the front door opened. Through a gap between the counter's base and the floor, she watched a shadow move across the dusty wooden planks. A boot stepped directly in front of her hiding spot, mere inches from her face. The leather was well worn but meticulously polished, the shoe of someone who paid attention to details. Grace held her breath, fighting the urge to cough in the dust-filled air. The boot shifted, and she dared to peek around the corner of the counter. An older man stood there, his posture rigid despite a noticeable limp as he surveyed the shop. He wore a neat brown jacket, and his gray hair was precisely trimmed. But what caught Grace's attention was his right hand. Where the ring finger should have been, there was only a stub. The missing finger triggered something in her memory. Grace's mind flashed to Arya's drawing, the one she had studied so intently in her office. In the corner, almost hidden among other details, had been a hand with 4 fingers. The child's attention to detail hadn't been random at all. The man moved toward the back of the shop, and Grace recognized his face from the newspaper clippings in the basement. Randall Briggs, the forensic analyst whose name had appeared in connection with every case. He walked with purpose, heading straight for the area behind the counter where the trapdoor lay exposed. Briggs muttered under his breath as he discovered the open trapdoor. "No, no, no," he hissed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Who's been here?" He slammed the trapdoor shut with enough force to make dust rain down from the ceiling. Grace's fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone, careful to keep the screen dimmed. She started recording, making sure to capture his face as he moved around the shop. Briggs yanked open drawers behind the counter, his movements becoming more agitated with each passing moment. His hand went to his jacket, pulling out a hunting knife with a worn handle. The blade caught what little light filtered through the boarded windows, and Grace had to suppress a gasp. Briggs tested the edge with his thumb, a gesture that seemed habitual, practiced. The methodical way he handled the knife matched everything she had seen in the basement: the careful labels, the organized trophies, the precise documentation of his victims. This wasn't just a man covering his tracks. This was someone who took pride in his work, who planned every detail. Suddenly, a car horn blared from the street outside. Briggs froze, knife half raised. Another horn followed, accompanied by the sound of raised voices. Just a typical traffic dispute, but it was enough. Briggs cursed softly and returned the knife to his jacket. He made one more quick sweep of the area around the trapdoor, then moved swiftly toward the front of the shop. Grace remained motionless until she heard the bell above the door jingle and the sound of his limping footsteps fade away. Even then, she waited several more minutes, counting her heartbeats until she was certain he was gone. When she finally emerged from behind the counter, her legs were shaking so badly she had to lean against the wall. She pulled Arya's drawing from her bag with trembling hands, studying it more carefully than ever before. There in the corner was the hand she remembered, 4 fingers rendered in precise detail, the missing digit not an accident or a child's mistake, but an observation captured with chilling accuracy. The realization hit Grace like a physical blow. Arya hadn't just drawn what she remembered or imagined. She had drawn what she witnessed. The child must have seen Briggs that night, must have watched him frame her father for Officer Keene's murder. Every detail in her drawings wasn't just art. They were evidence, testimony rendered in the only language Arya trusted. Grace clutched her phone with its recorded evidence and hurried to her car. Her hands shook as she inserted the key into the ignition. As she pulled away from the curb, her heart still pounding against her ribs, she glanced again at Arya's drawing on the passenger seat. The 4-fingered hand seemed to wave at her, a detail so small yet so crucial, the kind of detail only a child watching from the shadows would notice and remember. For the first time since taking Eli's case, Grace felt the full weight of what Arya had been trying to tell them all along. The child hadn't retreated into silence because of trauma alone. She had been speaking the whole time, telling her story through every careful line and shadow in her drawings. Grace had dismissed them as the work of a traumatized child, but now she understood. Arya had been the only one truly seeing, the only one brave enough to tell the truth in her own way. Grace entered the foster home the next morning with determination in her stride. This time, she carried a thick manila folder under her arm, filled with evidence that would either confirm or shatter her growing suspicions. The social worker led her to Arya's room, where the little girl sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by drawings. "Hi, Arya," Grace said softly, pulling up a small chair. "I brought something to show you." She kept her voice gentle, remembering how the child had responded to her previous brusqueness with complete withdrawal. Arya looked up briefly, her dark eyes registering Grace's presence before returning to her current drawing. Grace noticed the child's hands were stained with charcoal, and several new sketches were pinned to the wall behind her. "I went to the place you drew," Grace continued, carefully laying out the copied blueprint on the bed. "The pawn shop. I found the basement, exactly where you showed me it would be." She paused, watching Arya's hand still over her paper. "You were right, Arya. There was something down there that people needed to see." Grace pulled out her phone and showed Arya the photos she'd taken in the basement. The child's eyes widened slightly at the images of the shrine, the trophies, the newspaper clippings. Her fingers twitched against her sketch pad, but she remained silent. "Someone else came while I was there," Grace said, pulling out a rough sketch she'd made of Briggs. "A man with a missing finger, like this one you drew." She placed Arya's original drawing next to her sketch. For the first time since Grace had known her, Arya reached out and took something offered to her. She studied Grace's sketch of Briggs, her head tilted slightly. Then, with deliberate movements, she flipped the paper over and picked up her charcoal. Grace watched, hardly daring to breathe as Arya's small hands moved across the paper with precise strokes. The child added something to the man's neck, a pendant in the shape of a bird, detailed down to its spread wings and curved beak. "You saw this?" Grace asked quietly. "He was wearing this necklace?" Arya nodded slowly, her first direct response to any of Grace's questions. She pushed the drawing back toward Grace, then returned to her own sketch pad, her message delivered. Back in her office, Grace sat at her computer, the drawing with the bird pendant propped against her monitor. She'd spent hours digging through personnel records, following the thread of Randall Briggs's career. His file painted a picture of excellence, 30 years as a forensic analyst, dozens of commendations, a sterling reputation. But as Grace dug deeper, she found something else. A personal note in his file from 15 years ago. Emergency leave granted following the death of his son, Private Thomas Briggs, in Fallujah. Grace's heart began to race as she cross-referenced the date with Eli's military records. Private Briggs had been under Eli's command when he died in an ambush. Grace pulled up more recent records. Briggs had retired abruptly 8 years ago, shortly after Eli returned to civilian life. There was no official scandal, nothing in his file to suggest misconduct. But Grace found notes in performance reviews about increasing isolation and concerning behavior patterns. One supervisor had written, "Recommended psychological evaluation, refused." She clicked through photographs attached to various department ceremonies and awards. In one from 10 years ago, Briggs stood at a podium accepting a civil service medal. Around his neck hung a silver pendant, a bird with spread wings exactly as Arya had drawn it. Grace's hands shook as she printed everything. Each new piece fit perfectly into the puzzle Arya had been trying to show them all along. Briggs hadn't just been a forensic analyst working these cases. He'd been orchestrating them, using his position to manipulate evidence and target specific victims. And Eli, the man he blamed for his son's death, had become his perfect scapegoat. That night, Grace spread everything across her desk. The basement photos, Briggs's personnel records, and most importantly, Arya's drawings. She arranged them chronologically, seeing how each piece connected to the next. The child's artwork wasn't just pictures, they were testimony, recorded in the only way Arya knew how to speak. Grace pulled out her phone and scrolled to a number she hadn't called in years. Marcus Chen, her former colleague in the district attorney's office. They'd worked together before she moved to appeals, and she knew he was one of the few prosecutors who would listen without dismissing her outright. She pressed dial, checking her watch. It was late, but this couldn't wait. The phone rang 3 times before Marcus answered, his voice groggy. "Grace? It's almost midnight." "Marcus, I need you to listen carefully," Grace said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You sentenced the wrong man, and the right one is about to disappear." The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of Jerry's Diner, a quiet spot 3 blocks from the courthouse where lawyers and clerks often grabbed their morning coffee. Grace sat in a corner booth, her fingers drumming against a thick manila envelope as she watched the door. At precisely 7:30 a.m., Liam Reyes walked in, his tie slightly crooked and dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he'd had as little sleep as she had. He spotted her immediately, but took his time ordering coffee before making his way to her table. It was a practiced move. Nothing unusual about two attorneys having breakfast. "You look terrible," he said by way of greeting, sliding into the booth across from her. "Thanks, you're not exactly fresh as a daisy yourself." Grace pushed a menu aside, leaning forward. "Did you read my message?" Liam added cream to his coffee with careful precision. "About Randall Briggs? Grace, do you know how this sounds? He's got 30 years of decorated service. The evidence against Ramirez was solid." "Was it?" Grace slid the manila envelope across the table. "Take a look. Really look." Liam glanced around the diner before opening the envelope. His eyebrows rose as he examined the basement photos. "Where did you get these?" "The condemned pawn shop. There's a hidden room that wasn't in any official blueprints." Grace tapped one photo showing the shrine of trophies. "Look at the dates, the labels. Every item corresponds to a solved case Briggs worked on." Liam spread out more photos, his coffee forgotten. His expression changed as he came to Officer Keene's bloodied badge. "This is evidence tampering at minimum, but it doesn't prove Briggs killed Keene." "Keep going," Grace urged. "Look at the drawings." Liam pulled out Arya's sketches, studying them with growing interest. The architectural accuracy of the basement layout made him pause. "The kid drew these? Ramirez's daughter?" "She saw everything, Liam. She was there that night, waiting in a car across the street. She's been trying to tell us the truth, the only way she knows how." Grace pointed to the detail of the missing finger, the bird pendant. "Every detail matches Briggs, and look at this. Newspaper clippings he kept of military personnel, all linked to cases he worked, including Eli Ramirez, whose unit lost Briggs's son in Fallujah." The waitress approached their table, but Liam waved her away with a practiced smile. He leafed through more documents, his legal mind cataloging and connecting the pieces. "It's circumstantial," he said finally. "Compelling but circumstantial. No judge will grant a stay based on this alone." "That's why I need your help." Grace lowered her voice. "The surveillance footage from that night, it was ruled corrupted during the trial. But what if it wasn't? What if Briggs used his position to make it disappear?" Liam's expression shifted. "You think there's a backup?" "Evidence procedures require multiple copies, especially in capital cases. But Briggs knew the system, knew how to bury things. Check the storage logs. Look for misfiled evidence, anything logged under the wrong case number." Liam gathered the documents back into the envelope, his movements careful and methodical. "If I do this and find nothing, it could cost both our careers. You understand that?" Grace met his gaze steadily. "And if we do nothing, an innocent man dies while a killer walks free. Can you live with that?" The question hung between them. Finally, Liam stood, tucking the envelope under his arm. "Give me 2 hours. Meet me in my office." Grace watched him leave, then paid for the untouched coffee. The morning crowd was picking up, lawyers and courthouse staff filtering in for their daily rituals. None of them knew that just blocks away, the foundations of a capital case were beginning to crack. 2 hours later, Grace sat in Liam's office, watching him boot up an ancient computer system. The room smelled of dust and old paper. The evidence archives weren't exactly a priority for technological upgrades. "Found it buried under a drug possession case from 3 years ago," Liam explained, inserting a backup tape. "Wrong date, wrong case number, wrong everything. Someone wanted this lost." The screen flickered to life, showing grainy black and white footage of the pawnshop's interior. Liam fast-forwarded through hours of mundane business transactions until the timestamp showed 9:47 p.m., about an hour before the shooting. "There," Grace pointed. A figure appeared at the back door, moving with purpose. Even in the grainy footage, they could make out Briggs's distinctive limp. He wore gloves and carried a duffel bag. "He knew the cameras were there," Liam muttered. "Didn't even try to hide his face. He must have planned to destroy the footage anyway." They watched as Briggs moved through the shop with familiar ease, speaking briefly to the clerk. The timestamp showed him staying for nearly 30 minutes, during which he made several trips to the basement door. He was setting the stage, Grace said, getting everything in place. At 10:23 p.m., Briggs emerged from behind the counter. The camera caught a clear shot of him placing something there, a gun matching the murder weapon. Minutes later, he exited through the back door, leaving it slightly ajar. The footage continued. At 10:52 p.m., Eli Ramirez appeared at the front door, soaking wet from the rain, moving like a man in a daze. Everything about his body language screamed disorientation. Classic PTSD episode, exactly as the defense had argued. Grace exhaled slowly, watching the pieces of Briggs's plan fall into place. He set the whole scene. Liam stopped the playback, his face grim. This changes everything. The gun placement alone proves premeditation, just not by Ramirez. We need to get this to a judge, Grace said. Tonight, before Briggs realizes we found it. The fluorescent lights of the prison visiting room cast harsh shadows across Eli's face as Grace took her seat opposite the thick glass partition. His orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight since her last visit. Dark circles ringed his eyes and his hands trembled slightly as he picked up the phone receiver. 3 days. Just 3 days until his scheduled execution. The thought made Grace's stomach twist as she lifted her own receiver. "Mr. Ramirez," she began, then softened her tone. "Eli, I need to tell you something important." He nodded slightly, his gaze distant. He'd been like this since the conviction, present but somehow not fully there, as if part of him had already accepted his fate. "We found evidence about what really happened that night." Grace leaned forward, watching his face carefully. "Do you remember a man named Randall Briggs? He was a forensic analyst for the department." Eli's expression remained blank for a moment. Then something flickered in his eyes, recognition, followed by a shadow of fear. "He was there," Grace continued, "at the pawn shop before you arrived. We have surveillance footage proving he planted the murder weapon." Eli's hands tightened around the phone receiver. "The man who looked at me," he said softly. "When they brought me in for questioning, he stood in the corner, watching, looked at me like..." He swallowed hard. "Like he already knew what I'd done. Like he was playing judge." He was. Grace pulled out a photo of Briggs from her file and pressed it against the glass. "Is this him?" Eli studied the image. His breathing quickened slightly as fragments of memory surfaced. "That night, there are pieces I couldn't put together, but I remember a sting in my neck. Then everything went fuzzy. Saw someone moving away from me, limping." He touched his neck unconsciously as if feeling the phantom prick of a needle. "When I tried to stand up, the room was spinning. Then Officer Keene came in and..." He shook his head. "It all goes black after that." "Look at the photo again," Grace urged. "Is this the man you saw?" Eli's eyes focused on Briggs's face. His hand trembled against the glass. "Yes," he whispered. "That's him. But why?" "His son was under your command in Fallujah, the one who didn't make it back." Understanding dawned in Eli's eyes, followed by a deep sadness. "Marcus Briggs. He was a good kid, brave. The ambush. I tried to reach him, but..." His voice cracked. "I see his face every night." "Briggs blamed you," Grace explained. "He spent years planning this, used his position to manipulate evidence, set you up. He knew about your PTSD episodes, knew how to make it look like you snapped." Eli absorbed this in silence. Grace could see the weight of it settling on him, not just the revelation of Briggs's betrayal, but the realization that his imprisonment, his death sentence, had all been part of a calculated revenge. A guard appeared at the door, leading a small figure into the visiting room. Aria. She wore a plain blue dress, her dark hair neatly braided, but her eyes held the same solemn intensity Grace had come to know. The social worker accompanying her kept a protective hand on her shoulder. Eli straightened in his chair at the sight of his daughter. His entire demeanor changed, the defeated slump of his shoulders lifting, a spark returning to his eyes. Arya took her seat, her small hands immediately pressing against the glass partition. For a long moment, father and daughter just looked at each other. No words were spoken, none were needed. Then, slowly, Eli raised his hand to match Arya's on the glass. Their palms aligned, separated by inches of bulletproof barrier. Grace watched as something remarkable happened. Eli smiled. It was small, tinged with sadness, but real. The first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Arya didn't smile back, but her eyes softened, and she leaned her forehead against the glass. They stayed like that, connected yet separate until the guard signaled that time was up. Arya withdrew her hand reluctantly, but before standing, she pulled something from her pocket, a folded piece of paper. She showed it to Eli through the glass, a drawing of two hands touching with rays of light breaking through between them. Eli pressed his fingers to the glass one last time as Arya was led away. Grace could see him fighting to maintain his composure, to stay strong for his daughter even as she disappeared from view. "She never stopped believing in you," Grace said softly. Eli nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was stronger than before. "What happens now?" "We have surveillance footage proving Briggs was there. We have his shrine of trophies, including Keen's badge. We have your identification of him, and Arya's drawings showing details only an eyewitness could know." Grace gathered her files. "I need to make a call." She left the visiting room, walking quickly through the prison's sterile corridors until she reached the parking lot. The late afternoon sun was starting to fade, casting long shadows across the concrete. She pulled out her phone and dialed Liam's number. He answered on the first ring. "Tell me you got something." "We have motive, presence, and now ID," Grace said, unlocking her car. Eli confirmed it was Briggs who drugged him that night. Remembered the limp, the injection, everything. Liam was quiet for a moment. "I'll take it to the governor's office right away, but Grace... He hesitated. "We need one more thing. Something concrete to tie Briggs directly to that badge. The defense will claim anyone could have put it in that basement. We need a forensic link, DNA, fingerprints, anything." Grace leaned against her car, feeling the weight of time pressing down. 3 days. They had 3 days to find that final piece of evidence, or all of this would mean nothing. Eli would still die, Briggs would walk free, and Arya would lose her father forever. "I know," she said. "We'll find it. We have to." The morning sun cast long shadows through the broken windows of the condemned pawn shop as Grace led a forensics team through the front door. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, marking off the entrance. The legal order in her hand felt heavy, their last chance to find the evidence they needed. "Over here," Grace called to Sarah Chen, the lead forensics technician. She pointed to the trapdoor behind the counter. "The basement access is through there." Sarah nodded, adjusting her protective gear and gloves. "We'll need proper lighting. Johnson, bring down the portable floods." The team descended carefully into the basement, their footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. The musty air hit them immediately, thick with decades of dust and decay. Sarah's team set up bright LED floodlights, transforming the dark space into a stark crime scene. "The shrine is behind that false wall," Grace said, pointing to the broken panel she'd discovered days earlier. "Everything needs to be documented exactly as we found it." Sarah approached the wall methodically, camera in hand. "Nobody touch anything until I've photographed and mapped the entire space." She began taking detailed shots of the entrance, the wall damage, and the room's layout. Grace watched as the team worked with precise efficiency. They photographed and cataloged every trophy, every newspaper clipping, every scrap of evidence that pointed to Briggs's obsession. The badge drawer received special attention. Sarah carefully swabbed its handle and edges for touch DNA. "Look at this," Sarah called, pointing her camera at the pegboard of clippings. "These pins have been handled repeatedly. The oils from fingers have actually stained the wood." She swabbed the areas around each pin, marking them carefully as individual samples. The team spent hours processing the scene. They collected hair fibers from corners where they'd settled undisturbed for years. They dusted for prints on surfaces Briggs might have touched. They carefully removed Officer Keene's badge along with other trophies, sealing each in separate evidence bags. "The blood on this badge appears to be original," Sarah noted, examining Keene's badge under a portable light. "Not degraded much in the controlled environment down here. We should get good DNA." Grace felt her heart rate quicken. "How long for preliminary results?" "I'll put a rush on it, given the circumstances." Sarah glanced at Grace knowingly. "We'll have something within hours." The scene processing continued well into the afternoon. Grace stayed to witness everything, making sure the chain of custody remained unbroken. When they finally emerged from the basement, the sun was low in the sky, casting orange light through the broken windows. Sarah approached Grace as her team packed up their equipment. "We'll start processing immediately. I'll call you the moment we have anything concrete." Grace nodded, watching the evidence bags being carefully stored for transport. Each one could contain the link they needed, the proof that would save Eli's life. Hours later, Grace paced in her office while the lab worked. The clock seemed to mock her with each passing minute. Finally, her phone rang. "Grace?" "It's Sarah. You need to see this." The fluorescent lights of the crime lab hummed overhead as Sarah led Grace to her workstation. Multiple computer screens displayed test results and magnified images. "First, the fingerprints," Sarah began, pulling up a comparison chart. "We found multiple clear prints on the drawer handle and the wall edges. They're a match to Randall Briggs, no question." Grace leaned closer to the screen. "And the DNA?" Sarah clicked to another window. "This is where it gets interesting. The blood on Keene's badge? Perfect match to him. But we found something else." She pointed to a data chart. 2 other trophies in that drawer had trace DNA. "We ran them through CODIS." She pulled up 2 case files. "Meet Michael Torres and James Wilson. Both former law enforcement, both found dead in apparent robberies gone wrong. Cases went cold years ago." Grace's breath caught. "And their DNA was on items in Briggs's trophy drawer?" "Not just DNA. Their cases share remarkable similarities with Keene's murder. Same type of location, same method of staging the scene. And guess who processed the forensic evidence in both cases?" "Briggs," Grace whispered. "Exactly." Sarah handed Grace a thick folder. "Here's the full report. Everything's documented, chain of custody intact. This proves Briggs not only had access to Keene's badge, but connects him directly to 2 other murders with the same signature." Grace clutched the report, her hands shaking slightly. This was it, the missing piece they needed. She thanked Sarah and rushed from the lab, already dialing Liam's number. She found him in his office despite the late hour. His tie was loose, coffee cups littering his desk. He looked up as she burst in, waving the lab report. "We got it," she said breathlessly. "DNA, fingerprints, everything, plus 2 more victims linked to Briggs." Liam grabbed the report, flipping through it rapidly. His eyes widened as he read. Without a word, he reached for his phone and dialed. "This is Ada Reyes. I need to speak to Ms. Harrison immediately." "Yes, I know what time it is. This concerns the Ramirez execution." He paused, listening. "Tell her it's about new evidence that proves actual innocence." Grace sank into a chair, watching as Liam spoke with the governor's chief of staff. Her heart pounded as he detailed the findings, emphasized the DNA matches, explained the pattern of murders. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sending everything now." He hung up and immediately began scanning the documents. "They'll review it right away. The governor's been briefed on the situation." "How long?" Grace asked. "They know we're down to 48 hours. They'll prioritize the stay request." He finished sending the files and looked at Grace. "Now we wait." Grace nodded numbly. She drove home in a daze, the events of the day replaying in her mind. In her apartment, she settled onto her couch, phone clutched in her hand. The clock on her wall ticked steadily as minutes stretched into hours. She thought of Eli in his cell, counting down his final hours. Of Arya, who might lose her father despite everything they'd uncovered. Of Briggs, who had nearly succeeded in his twisted revenge. The night deepened. Grace's phone remained silent on her lap. She watched the city lights through her window, waiting for the call that would determine whether justice would finally be served. Grace jerked awake on her couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Sunlight streamed through her apartment windows, and her phone showed a missed call from an unlisted number. Her heart raced as she accessed her voicemail. "Ms. Halpern, this is Catherine Marshall from the governor's office." The voice was clipped, professional. "We've received the stay request and new evidence for Eli Ramirez. The governor is personally reviewing the materials. We cannot provide any guarantees at this time, but we're treating this with appropriate urgency given the timeline. We'll be in touch." Grace pressed her fingers to her temples, processing the message. Not a yes, but not a no either. She checked the time, 7:43 a.m. Without bothering to change clothes, she grabbed her keys and headed for her car. The morning traffic was heavy as she made her way to Aria's foster home in the suburbs. The modest two-story house looked peaceful in the morning light, with toys scattered across the front lawn and a bicycle leaning against the porch. Mrs. Chen, Aria's foster mother, answered the door still in her robe. "Oh, Ms. Halpern, we weren't expecting you so early." "I'm sorry for the unannounced visit," Grace said. "I have news about Aria's father. Is she awake?" Mrs. Chen nodded, stepping aside. "She's been up since dawn, drawing as usual. She's in the sunroom." Grace found Aria sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers and colored pencils. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, casting a soft glow over her small form. She didn't look up when Grace entered. "Hey, Aria," Grace said softly. She moved slowly into the room, careful not to disturb the artwork spread around the girl. "I wanted to tell you what's happening with your dad." Aria's hand stilled over her current drawing, but she kept her eyes down. Grace knelt beside her, bringing herself to Aria's eye level. She noticed the dark circles under the child's eyes, the tension in her small shoulders. "The governor is looking at all the evidence we found. The special pictures you drew that helped us find the truth. They're part of what might save your dad." Aria's eyes finally lifted to meet Grace's. "You might have saved your father," Grace said gently. "We're still waiting to hear, but what you saw, what you showed us through your drawings, it made all the difference." For a long moment, Aria just stared at Grace. Then, without a word, she reached for a fresh sheet of paper. Her movements were deliberate as she selected her pencils and began to draw. Grace watched in silence as the image took shape under Aria's skilled hands. First came the high-arched ceiling of a courtroom, then the ornate stained glass windows along the walls. Light seemed to pour through the colored glass in Aria's drawing, filling the space with warmth and hope. In the center of the page, two figures emerged, Eli and Aria, standing hand in hand. Their faces were turned toward the light streaming through the windows. There was something different about this drawing. No shadows lurked in the corners. No hidden dangers waited to be discovered. For the first time, Aria had created an image of pure hope. Grace felt her throat tighten as she studied the drawing. "It's beautiful, Aria." Aria traced her finger over the joined hands in the picture, then looked up at Grace with clear, determined eyes. The day passed slowly. Grace spent hours making calls, checking on the status of the stay request, coordinating with Liam. As evening approached, storm clouds began gathering over the city. She was driving home when the rain started, fat drops splattering against her windshield. The storm intensified quickly, sheets of water reducing visibility to mere feet. Her phone rang through the car's speakers. "Grace?" Liam's voice was tight with urgency. "What's wrong?" "He's fleeing. Briggs didn't show up to his weekly check-in. Marshals are after him. He's on the move." Grace's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she pulled to the side of the road. Through her rain-streaked windows, she could see the city lights blurring in the downpour. "Then we better move faster." The windshield wipers worked furiously against the downpour as Grace navigated through the city streets. Her phone screen glowed on the dashboard, Liam's voice crackling through the speakers. They traced his cell signal to an old family property about 30 miles outside the city limits, Liam said. "It's registered to his late wife's name. Marshals are en route, but they're coming from the federal building downtown. This weather's slowing everyone down." Grace squinted through the rain-blurred glass, catching sight of the freeway entrance ahead. Without hesitation, she merged onto the ramp. "Grace? Tell me you're not heading out there." Liam's voice carried a mix of concern and frustration. "We're running out of time," she replied, pressing down on the accelerator. "Eli's execution is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If Briggs disappears now, that's it." "The marshals will handle this. You're not law enforcement." "I'm already on the freeway, Liam." The rain drummed steadily on the roof of her car. "Just tell me exactly where this property is." She heard Liam's heavy sigh through the speakers. "Old Mill Road, about 5 miles past the county line. It's a farmhouse set back from the main road. Grace, please wait for backup. Text me the exact address." She ended the call before he could argue further. The city lights faded behind her as Grace drove into the darkness of the rural outskirts. Her headlights cut through the rain, illuminating empty fields and scattered trees. The GPS guided her onto increasingly narrow roads, until finally she turned onto Old Mill Road, little more than a gravel path cutting through overgrown farmland. Her phone buzzed with another call from Liam, but she ignored it. Through the rain, she caught sight of a weathered mailbox, barely visible in her headlights. The number matched the address Liam had sent. Grace pulled off the road, cutting her engine but leaving the headlights on. They illuminated a path through tall grass leading to a dark shape in the distance. The farmhouse. It was a 2-story structure, its white paint gray with age, windows dark and shutters hanging askew. She grabbed her phone and the small flashlight from her glove compartment. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle as she stepped out of the car. Her shoes sank slightly into the muddy ground as she made her way toward the house. The front porch creaked under her weight. Grace tried the door handle, unlocked. It swung open with a low groan. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness inside, revealing a musty living room. Furniture was draped with sheets, thick dust coating every surface except for a clear path through the room. Someone had been here recently. Grace moved cautiously through the house, her light revealing more signs of recent activity. In what must have been a study, she found a desk cleared of dust. Papers were spread across it. Newspaper clippings, military records, surveillance photos. Her hands trembled slightly as she examined them. There were dozens of photos of Eli, leaving his apartment, at the grocery store, walking Arya to school. Some dated back years, long before the pawnshop incident. This wasn't a sudden act of revenge. Briggs had been watching, planning, waiting. A collection of war memorabilia lined the shelves. Medals, patches, photographs. One showed a younger Briggs standing proudly next to a young man in uniform, his son. They had the same eyes, the same determined set to their jaw. Another photo showed the son's military funeral, Briggs standing rigid and alone by the flag-draped coffin. Scattered among the surveillance photos were newspaper clippings about Eli's unit in Fallujah. Reports of the ambush that killed several soldiers, including Briggs's son. Eli's name was circled in red ink, angry notes scrawled in the margins. He left them behind and commander's duty to protect. Grace's flashlight beam caught something else, a door, slightly ajar, leading to what must be the basement. The sound of rain seemed to fade as she approached it. The stairs creaked as she descended. The basement was larger than she expected, concrete walls lined with metal shelving. Her light swept across tools, boxes, old furniture, and then stopped on a wooden table in the center of the room. On the table lay 2 objects, a silver pendant in the shape of a bird, and beside it, a handgun. Grace stepped closer. The gun was clean, recently oiled. Her flashlight reflected off its polished surface. A floorboard creaked behind her. "You ruined it." Briggs's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. Grace turned slowly. He stood at the foot of the stairs, a hunting rifle trained on her chest. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken with exhaustion or madness or both. "He was supposed to pay," Briggs muttered. Rain pattered steadily above them as they stood in the dim basement, the flashlight beam creating strange shadows on the concrete walls. The basement air grew thick with tension as Grace and Briggs faced each other, his rifle unwavering. Rain continued to drum overhead, creating an eerie rhythm in the darkness. Grace's flashlight beam caught the wild look in his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You don't understand," Briggs said, his voice trembling. "None of you understand what he did." He took a halting step forward, favoring his right leg. The rifle barrel gleamed dully in the flashlight's glow. "My boy trusted him, they all did." Briggs's words came faster now, spilling out like he'd held them in for years. "Commander Ramirez, the decorated hero. But where was he when the ambush came? Where was he when my Tommy bled out in that street?" Grace remained still, her hand slowly sliding into her coat pocket where her phone rested. Briggs didn't seem to notice, lost in his own pain. 3 years I spent analyzing evidence, building cases, watching guilty men walk free on technicalities. His grip tightened on the rifle. But Ramirez? He walked free every day, lived his life, had a daughter, while my boy rotted in the ground. "So you watched him," Grace said softly, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "For how long?" "Long enough." Briggs's laugh was hollow. Learned his routines, his weaknesses, waited for the right moment. Then that night at the pawn shop, it was perfect. His PTSD episodes were getting worse. Everyone knew it. Who'd question another veteran losing control? Grace's fingers found her phone. She kept her movements minimal, natural. And Officer Keene? Briggs's face twisted. Collateral damage. He wasn't supposed to be there. But he saw too much. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for justice. Justice? Grace's voice hardened slightly. Or revenge? "What's the difference?" Briggs snarled. "My son is still dead. Ramirez still gave the order that killed him. Someone had to make him pay." Grace pulled out her phone slowly, making sure Briggs could see it wasn't a weapon. "Before you pull that trigger, I want you to hear something." She pressed play. Eli's voice filled the basement, recorded during their prison visit. "Aria, honey, if you're hearing this, I know things are hard right now, but I need you to be strong, like we talked about. Remember when we used to draw together? How we'd make up stories about the shadows on the wall?" The recording continued, Eli's voice thick with emotion. "Those were the best days of my life, just sitting there with you, watching you create beautiful things out of darkness. You taught me how to see light again when all I could remember was war." Briggs's rifle wavered slightly. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this pain, but I want you to know. Everything I did, every order I gave was to try to bring people home. Sometimes we can't save everyone. And that weight, that guilt, it never leaves you." Grace watched Briggs' face change as the recording played. The manic energy seemed to drain from him, replaced by something more complex. Grief, recognition, doubt. "I see their faces every night," Eli's voice continued. "All the ones we lost. I hear their families crying. If I could trade places with any of them, I would. But all I can do now is try to be the father you deserve even from in here." The recording ended. The basement fell silent except for the steady rain above. Briggs's hands shook on the rifle. "Turn it off," he whispered. "That's who he is," Grace said quietly. "Not some monster you created in your mind. A father. A soldier who carries the same guilt you do." "Shut up." But the rifle barrel dipped lower, his conviction visibly cracking. It was all the opening Grace needed. In one fluid motion, she kicked out, connecting with the rifle. It clattered across the concrete floor as Briggs stumbled backward. He lunged for it, but Grace was faster, tackling him to the ground. They grappled in the darkness, flashlight forgotten, rolling across the cold floor. Briggs was stronger, but Grace fought with desperate intensity. His fist caught her shoulder. She drove her knee into his side. They crashed into the wooden table, sending the gun and bird pendant scattering. Grace spotted a door in the dim light filtering down the basement stairs. She broke free of Briggs's grip and scrambled toward it, throwing it open. Cool night air hit her face as she emerged into the rain. Red and blue lights suddenly flooded the yard. Police cars had surrounded the house, their sirens silent but lights painting the rain in alternating colors. Grace stumbled away from the door just as Briggs burst out behind her. "Freeze! Hands where we can see them." Multiple officers converged on them, weapons drawn. Briggs tried to run but slipped in the mud. 3 officers tackled him, driving him to the wet ground. He thrashed and screamed as they cuffed his hands behind his back. "You don't understand," he shouted, face pressed into the grass. "He deserved it. My boy deserved justice." Grace leaned against a nearby police car, her legs shaking with adrenaline crash. She watched as the officers pulled Briggs to his feet. Rain plastered his gray hair to his skull, his clothes soaked and muddy. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, all his careful planning and years of hatred amounting to this moment. A tall woman in a dark raincoat approached Grace, badge glinting on her belt. "Chief Investigator Martinez," she introduced herself. "Your DA friend called us, said we'd find everything we needed to close this case." Grace nodded, pushing wet hair from her face. The basement's full of evidence. Surveillance photos, planning documents, trophies from other victims. The murder weapon's on a table down there, along with DNA evidence linking him to Officer Keene's death. She took a shaky breath. "And upstairs, there's proof this vendetta against Ramirez goes back years. He stalked him, studied him, waited for the perfect moment to frame him." Martinez signaled to her forensics team, who began approaching the house with their equipment. "And you're sure it's enough?" she asked. "Enough to bury him?" Grace watched as Briggs was led to a waiting patrol car, still shouting about justice and revenge. She thought of Aria's drawings, of Eli's voice on the recording, of all the pieces that had led to this moment. "And then some," she said firmly. The execution chamber was a sterile, windowless room that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the mint-green walls, making everything appear washed out and unreal. Eli lay strapped to the gurney, his prison uniform replaced with a plain white gown that made his skin look even more pallid than usual. The priest, a silver-haired man with kind eyes, stood beside him, reading from a worn Bible in hushed tones. His words echoed softly against the cold walls. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Eli's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, his breathing shallow but steady. The fourth line was already in place, a thin plastic tube that would soon carry the lethal cocktail of drugs into his system. Two guards stood at attention near the door, their faces carefully blank, while the medical team made final preparations at a small metal table. Outside the chamber in the prison's administrative wing, Grace paced the narrow hallway like a caged animal. Her heels clicked against the linoleum floor as she moved back and forth, clutching a thick folder of documents. Liam stood nearby, his tie loosened, speaking rapidly into his phone. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice urgent. "The DNA evidence is conclusive. The ballistics report shows the bullet that killed Officer Keene came from Briggs's weapon, not Ramirez's service pistol. We have signed confessions from 2 lab technicians who helped Briggs falsify the original evidence." The governor's legal team huddled around a folding table, papers spread out before them. They worked with frantic energy, passing documents back and forth, making calls, checking timestamps. Every few seconds, someone would glance at the clock on the wall where the second hand moved with merciless precision. 3 minutes, Grace muttered, running her hands through her disheveled hair. "We need the governor's signature now." Inside the chamber, the medical team began their final checks. One of them swabbed Eli's arm with alcohol, the sharp smell cutting through the room's artificial stillness. The priest's voice grew softer, more urgent. Eli closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw Aria sitting cross-legged on their living room floor, charcoal smudged on her fingers as she drew. The memory was so vivid he could almost hear the scratch of her pencil against paper. The warden entered the chamber, his footsteps heavy. He nodded to the medical team, a signal to begin the procedure. One of them reached for the first syringe. In the hallway, Grace's phone buzzed. She grabbed it so quickly she almost dropped it. "Tell me you have it," she said, her voice raw with tension. "The governor's reviewing the final evidence now," Liam replied, pressing his phone harder against his ear. "His chief of staff says, wait." He fell silent, listening intently. "They're signing it. They're signing it right now." Grace spun toward the warden's office where his secretary was already picking up a ringing phone. The woman's eyes widened as she listened. She pressed a button on her desk, speaking rapidly into an intercom. Inside the chamber, the first drops of liquid began moving through the IV tube. Eli felt a cold sensation in his arm. The priest's voice seemed to come from very far away. The door burst open. "Stop!" the warden shouted, his face flushed. "Stop everything immediately!" The medical team froze. One of them quickly clamped the IV line, stopping the flow of drugs. 37 seconds had passed since they'd started the procedure. "Executive stay of execution," the warden announced, his voice slightly breathless. "Remove him from the gurney. Get medical attention here now." The room erupted into controlled chaos. The restraints were quickly unbuckled, and a medical team rushed in with emergency equipment. Eli lay still, his eyes unfocused, as they checked his vital signs and assessed his condition. "Pulse is steady," one medic reported, pressing fingers against Eli's wrist. "Blood pressure dropping but stabilizing. He received minimal dosage. Should recover with monitoring." Grace and Liam watched from the doorway as the medical team worked. Grace's hands were clenched so tight her knuckles had turned white. Liam placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "The evidence held," he said quietly. "The system worked this time." Grace didn't respond, her eyes fixed on Eli's face as color slowly returned to his cheeks. The medical team carefully transferred him to a wheelchair, attaching a portable heart monitor that beeped steadily in the quiet room. As they wheeled him toward the door, Eli's head lolled slightly. His eyes found Grace's face, and his lips moved. At first, no sound came out. Then, barely above a whisper, "She knew. My little girl knew." The words seemed to hang in the air as they wheeled him past. Grace stood motionless, her face a mask of professional calm, but her eyes betrayed a storm of emotions. Only when Eli disappeared around the corner did she finally let out the breath she'd been holding, a long exhale that seemed to carry the weight of the past several days. The sound echoed in the empty chamber, mixing with the steady beep of the heart monitor fading down the corridor and the rustle of the priest closing his Bible. Outside, through the prison's high windows, the first light of dawn was beginning to break over the city. The federal courthouse buzzed with anticipation, its marble halls filled to capacity. Journalists crowded the wooden benches, their notebooks ready. The gallery was standing room only, a sea of faces all focused on the front of the courtroom where Randall Briggs sat in an orange jumpsuit, his shoulders hunched. Judge Martinez adjusted her glasses as she read from the charging document, her voice clear and measured. "The defendant is charged with first-degree murder in the death of Officer Daniel Keene, conspiracy to commit murder, falsifying evidence, and obstruction of justice." Briggs stared straight ahead, his face emotionless. The missing ring finger on his right hand twitched slightly as each charge was read. Grace stood at the prosecutor's table, her posture straight and professional, but there was a quiet confidence in her movements as she arranged her evidence. She had spent the past week organizing everything meticulously. Aria's prophetic drawings laid out in clear plastic sleeves, the basement photos mounted on foam board, USB drives containing the restored security footage, and thick binders of DNA analysis reports. "Your Honor," Grace began, her voice steady, "the state presents overwhelming evidence of a calculated conspiracy spanning multiple years." She lifted the first of Aria's drawings, showing it to the court. "This drawing, made by an 8-year-old girl, led us to discover a hidden basement in the pawn shop where Officer Keene was murdered." The judge leaned forward, studying the detailed sketch. Grace continued, moving to the foam board displays. "These photos document what we found in that basement. A trophy room containing items from multiple victims, including Officer Keene's badge, still bearing traces of his blood." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Briggs's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Furthermore," Grace said, holding up a USB drive, "this recovered security footage shows the defendant entering the pawn shop 30 minutes before Eli Ramirez arrived. The footage, which was deliberately misfiled to appear corrupted, clearly shows Briggs planting the murder weapon." She played the video on the courtroom's display screens. The grainy footage showed Briggs' distinctive limp as he moved through the shop, his actions deliberate and practiced. DNA evidence recovered from the basement trophy room matches not only Officer Keene but 2 other unsolved cases, Grace continued, opening one of the binders. The defendant's fingerprints were found on multiple surfaces, and fibers from his clothing were recovered from the scene. Judge Martinez nodded slowly, reviewing the lab reports. The evidence mounted methodically, piece by piece, like a puzzle finally revealing its full picture. In the gallery, Eli sat with his hands folded, wearing a clean suit that still looked slightly unfamiliar on him. The past week had been a blur of medical checks, debriefings, and reunions. His face showed the strain of his ordeal, but his eyes were clear and focused. "The state calls Aria Ramirez to the stand," Grace announced. The courtroom fell silent. Aria rose from her seat beside a social worker, clutching her worn sketchbook against her chest. She walked toward the witness stand with small, measured steps, her dark hair neatly braided and tied with a blue ribbon. The bailiff helped her into the tall chair, and she sat very still, looking at her sketchbook rather than the crowd. Grace approached gently, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "Aria," Grace said softly, "can you show us the drawing you made last week, the one about the courtroom?" Aria nodded, opening her sketchbook carefully. She turned to the page showing the courtroom scene she had drawn before Eli's stay of execution was granted. The drawing showed father and daughter holding hands, light streaming through stained glass windows, every detail precise and hopeful. Grace held up the drawing for the court to see. "Your Honor, this drawing was made before any of us knew the outcome of Mr. Ramirez's case. Like her other drawings, it showed us something true before we could see it ourselves." Aria looked up then, her eyes finding her father. Eli sat straighter, his face softening as he met his daughter's gaze. The connection between them was almost tangible, filling the space between them with unspoken understanding. Judge Martinez leaned forward in her chair, her expression gentle. "Aria," she said, "would you like to say anything to the court?" The room held its breath. For months, Aria had maintained her silence, communicating only through her art. The social workers' reports all noted her selective mutism, her withdrawal from verbal communication following the trauma of her father's arrest. Aria looked down at her drawing one more time, then up at the judge. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "I drew the truth. Nobody listened, but he still came home." The simple words hit the room like a physical force. Several jurors wiped their eyes. A reporter in the front row dropped her pen. Even the court stenographer paused for a moment, touched by the raw honesty in the child's voice. Grace stood very still, feeling the weight of the moment. She glanced at Eli and saw tears running freely down his face as he reached out toward his daughter. Aria slipped off the witness stand and walked to him, taking his offered hand. Their fingers intertwined, a mirror image of the drawing that had shown this very moment. The courtroom seemed to fade away around them, leaving just a father and daughter, reunited after months of separation and fear, their bond stronger for having been tested. The light from the high windows fell across them, casting warm patterns on the courtroom floor, so similar to the stained glass illumination in Aria's prophetic drawing that it seemed almost supernatural. But there was nothing supernatural about the love between them, about a child's unwavering faith in her father's innocence, about the power of truth finally coming to light. The autumn breeze rustled through the park's maple trees, sending golden leaves spiraling down around the weathered wooden bench where Eli and Aria sat. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass, and the air held that crisp October freshness that made everything feel clean and new. Eli sat quietly, his military jacket hanging looser on his frame than it had months ago. Prison had taken its toll, leaving him thinner and more subdued, but there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there before. His gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon where the city skyline met the morning sky, watching without really seeing, lost in thought. Beside him, Aria hunched over her sketchbook, her small fingers moving with practiced precision across the page. She had traded her old, worn notebook for a proper artist's pad, a gift from Grace, and her strokes were confident as she captured the sparrows hopping along the pathway before them. The birds pecked at scattered breadcrumbs, unaware they were being immortalized in careful lines of graphite. The scratch of Aria's pencil provided a gentle rhythm to their shared silence. Eli occasionally glanced down at her work, a small smile touching his lips as he watched the birds take shape on the page. Each drawing she created now felt like a gift rather than a cry for help, and that transformation alone was worth everything they'd endured. The familiar click of dress shoes on pavement announced Grace's arrival before they saw her. She approached with 3 paper cups balanced carefully in a carrier, her business attire replaced by casual weekend wear, jeans and a soft sweater that made her look younger, more relaxed. "Hot chocolate for the artist," Grace said, carefully extracting a cup with extra whipped cream. "Black coffee for the soldier, and pumpkin spice for the reformed workaholic." She settled onto the bench beside them, positioning herself so Arya sat between the 2 adults. Arya accepted her cup with both hands, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she inhaled the sweet aroma. Eli took his coffee with a grateful nod, wrapping his fingers around the warm cup. "How's the recovery program going?" Grace asked, blowing gently on her drink. Eli shifted slightly, considering his words. "Better," he said finally. "The new therapist, Dr. Chen, she understands military trauma, doesn't try to fix everything at once." He took a careful sip of coffee. "She thinks I might be ready to start working with other vets soon, maybe do some peer counseling." Grace nodded approvingly. "You'd be good at that. You know what they're going through, what they need to hear." "What they need is someone who'll listen," Eli said quietly. "Really listen, like you did with Arya." At the sound of her name, Arya looked up from her sketchbook. She had set aside the bird drawings and started something new. 3 figures seated on a bench, their poses familiar. Grace leaned over to look and her breath caught slightly. In the drawing, all 3 of them were smiling. It was the first time Arya had drawn herself with a smile, and the detail wasn't lost on any of them. The sketched version of Grace sat with relaxed shoulders, her usual tension absent. Eli's drawn counterpart looked stronger, more present, and Arya's self-portrait showed a quiet joy that felt both honest and earned. "I took that teaching position at the law school," Grace mentioned, her eyes still on Arya's drawing. "Starting next semester. Ethics in criminal defense and a seminar on wrongful convictions." She smiled wryly. "Figured I should put all this experience to good use." "You'll shake them up," Eli said with a hint of amusement. "Make them think twice about taking the easy path." "That's the plan." Grace sipped her pumpkin spice latte. "What about you 2? Any plans beyond the counseling idea?" Eli glanced down at his daughter, who was adding careful shadows to her drawing. Taking it slow, Arya's art therapist suggested we might try some classes together, drawing, painting, something we can share. Arya nodded without looking up, but her pencil moved faster, adding more detail to their bench scene. The drawn version of her father had his arm around her shoulders, protective, but not confining. The sketched Grace leaned in slightly as if sharing a secret with them both. "We're thinking about getting a dog," Eli added. "Something gentle, good with kids." "A therapy dog might help," Grace agreed. "Both of you could use some unconditional love." Arya paused in her drawing, looking up at Grace with an expression that seemed to say they already had that. Grace felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with her coffee. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their beverages and watching the morning unfold around them. Other park visitors jogged past or walked their dogs, nodding friendly greetings. It felt normal, peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had brought them together. When they finally stood to leave, the sun broke through a bank of clouds that had been threatening rain. Golden light flooded the park, turning the autumn leaves into stained glass and casting long, warm shadows across the grass. Arya tilted her face up to the sudden brightness, then looked back down at her completed drawing. The 3 figures on the page seemed to glow with the same warm light that surrounded them now. "It's brighter now," she said softly, her voice clear in the morning air. Eli squeezed her hand gently, his fingers wrapping protectively around her smaller ones. The simple gesture contained volumes: gratitude, love, protection, hope. All the things that had seemed impossible just months ago, now made real by a child's unwavering faith and a lawyer's determination to find the truth. If you enjoyed the story of Arya and Eli, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.